Richard's fork stopped halfway to his mouth when Maggie Calloway said she didn't understand what a Series B round was. The table went quiet. 12 people in evening were at the Harpeth Hotel in Franklin, Tennessee, all waiting to see what he'd do with the silence his wife had just handed him. He set his fork down slowly. He didn't yell. He didn't throw a single thing. Sometimes the deepest wounds arrive wrapped in the calmest voices. He looked across the dinner table, folded his hands, and studied her with the detached expression of someone evaluating a stranger instead of the woman who had stood beside him for 30 years. Then he said 7 words that quietly destroyed everything she thought she knew. "You're the biggest disappointment of my life." A few people laughed, the kind of laugh that comes out before anyone decides if it's allowed. She didn't cry. She simply stared at the man she had loved since she was 24 years old, wondering how 30 years of sacrifice could disappear into one cruel sentence. He thought she had nothing left without him. He thought the quiet woman who packed his lunches, remembered every birthday, and celebrated every promotion had never become anything herself. He was wrong, not because she'd been living a secret double life, not because she was hiding a fortune somewhere, but because he had spent so many years looking through her that he'd forgotten to truly see her. And by the time he finally understood the woman he'd called a disappointment, she would already be gone. Not chasing another man, not chasing revenge, simply walking toward a life she should have chosen years ago. Maggie kept smiling. She always kept smiling. But under the table, her hand found the small leather folder in her lap, the one with the trust documents Richard had never once asked to see, the one that had his company's entire expansion loan sitting inside it with her signature on the approval line. He had called her a disappointment in front of his new investors. He had no idea that the money making this dinner possible was hers. And in 11 days, she had a decision to make about whether it stayed that way. If you've ever given your best years to someone who slowly forgot your worth, this story is for you. Because what happened next wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about becoming richer. It wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about something far more powerful. The moment a woman stops asking to be appreciated and starts remembering who she was before someone convinced her she wasn't enough. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 6 months earlier, nobody at that table would have believed any of it. Maggie Calloway was 52 years old, with soft brown waves she'd worn long since college, the kind of long hair that made strangers assume she'd never worked a serious day in her life. She had, in fact, spent 11 years managing her late father's investment firm from behind the scenes, a small boutique fund out of Nashville that her father, Walter Ashford, had built from nothing and left entirely to her when he died, on the condition, written into the trust itself, that her involvement remain anonymous to anyone doing business with the fund unless she chose otherwise. Walter had been a quiet man who believed money moved better when nobody was performing for it. Maggie had honored that. She managed the fund's investments from a home office with a view of their backyard oak tree, wearing cardigans, answering emails under the name M. Ashford, and letting the world believe she was simply Richard Calloway's wife, a woman who baked for the church fundraiser and picked up his dry cleaning. Richard ran an engineering consulting firm, Calloway Structural, which he'd built up over 18 years into something respectable but never quite thriving. 3 years ago, when the firm nearly folded during a lawsuit over a bridge inspection gone wrong, it was M. Ashford's fund that quietly extended the loan that kept the doors open. Richard never knew where the money came from. His attorney, a careful man named Denny Ford, handled the paperwork, and the terms were simple. The fund would remain silent. The loan would renew annually pending review, and Richard would never learn whose signature approved it. Maggie had made that decision in a hospital cafeteria the night after Richard's surgery for a ruptured appendix, holding his hand and thinking about the 18 years they'd built together, and she hadn't hesitated. She loved him. She wanted his business to survive. She never once considered that the loan would become the very thing that let him stop seeing her. Somewhere in that survival, something in Richard changed. Maybe it was relief curdling into arrogance, or maybe the fear of nearly losing everything made him grip harder at the version of success he thought he was supposed to have. He started going to industry dinners without asking her to come. He started correcting her in front of colleagues, small things at first, the way she pronounced a client's name, the way she poured wine, and Maggie let them go because 30 years of marriage teaches you which battles are worth the bruise. Their daughter, Olivia, 26 and sharp as her grandfather had been, noticed before Maggie let herself admit it out loud. "Mom, he talks to you like you're an intern who keeps making mistakes," Olivia said one Sunday over coffee, and Maggie had laughed it off, because admitting it meant deciding what to do about it. There had been other moments before that dinner, small ones that Maggie had folded away like receipts she never planned to look at again. There was the spring gala for the Williamson County Business Association, where Richard introduced her to a table of contractors as the reason I get home-cooked meals and nothing else, while the wives beside her talked about their own careers in marketing and law, and one even ran a nonprofit that had been featured in the local paper. Maggie had smiled and asked polite questions about their work, and nobody at that table thought to ask her a single question back, because Richard had already told them, without meaning to, that there was nothing worth asking. There was the afternoon Richard hired a new project manager, a bright 28-year-old named Grace, and came home talking for 45 minutes about how sharp she was, how she understood spreadsheets Richard himself barely followed, and Maggie sat there listening, thinking of the risk models she'd built that same morning for a manufacturing client, and said nothing, because saying something would have meant explaining a life Richard had never once asked about. Each of these moments was small enough to survive on its own. It was only stacked together, quietly, over years, that they became something with real weight. What finally cracked it open was the Bishop deal. Calloway Structural had been chasing a contract with Bishop Development, a Nashville firm looking to build out a chain of mixed-use properties across Middle Tennessee, and Richard had been chasing it for 8 months with the kind of desperation that makes a man sloppy. He needed the expansion loan renewed early to show Bishop's investors that his firm had the capital cushion to handle a project that size. He needed it renewed in 11 days, before the dinner where he'd present final numbers to Marcus Bishop and his partners. He didn't know the renewal decision sat on Maggie's desk, inside a manila folder next to her reading glasses, waiting for her signature. Denny Ford came by the house on a Tuesday afternoon while Richard was at the office, and he laid it out plainly the way he always did. "The fund's return on this loan has been below target for 2 years running, Maggie. If this were any other client, we'd have pulled back already. I need to know what you want to do." Maggie sat with her tea going cold and thought about the man who, 3 nights earlier, had introduced her to a room of contractors as my wife, who doesn't really do the business side of things, while she stood there having personally kept his business side of things alive. She thought about her father, who used to say that real power never needed an audience. She told Denny she needed a little more time. The dinner at the Harpeth Hotel came 6 days later, before Maggie had made her decision, and it was there, over the appetizer course, that Richard made his. Marcus Bishop had asked Maggie a friendly, if pointed, question about the funding structure behind Richard's expansion, clearly testing whether the wife understood her husband's business at all, and Maggie, who understood it better than anyone at that table, had given a modest, deflecting answer, the kind of answer 30 years of practice had taught her to give. That's when Richard called her a disappointment, wrapped in a joke, delivered with a smile, the kind of cruelty that's designed to look like affection if anyone ever calls it out later. Maggie smiled through it, the way she always did, and underneath the table her fingers found the folder she'd brought without quite admitting to herself why she'd brought it. For a moment after Richard said it, Maggie thought about doing what a different woman might have done in her position, reaching into that leather folder right there at the table, setting the loan documents next to the breadbasket, and asking Marcus Bishop if he'd like to know whose signature had kept Calloway structural lights on for the past 3 years. She could see the whole scene play out in her mind, Richard's face collapsing in real time, the contractor's laughter curdling into silence, a story people would tell at other dinners for years. She let the thought pass through her the way you let a wave pass over your feet at the shore, felt its pull, and didn't move. Her father used to say that the people who need an audience for their power usually don't have very much of it. She finished her wine instead, complimented the chef when the entrees came out, and asked Marcus Bishop a genuinely sharp question about his firm's timeline for permitting in Williamson County, one that made him pause and look at her a little differently before Richard steered the conversation back to himself. She didn't confront him that night. She didn't cry in the car, either, though Richard probably expected her to. The way he'd apologize the next morning with flowers and call it just a joke. Come on, Max. Instead, she drove to Denny Ford's office the following morning, in her cardigan, with her long hair pulled back, and she signed the paperwork that let the expansion loan lapse quietly at the end of the month, citing standard portfolio review language that gave Richard's firm 90 days to secure alternative financing. No headline, no confrontation, no public reckoning at a dinner table full of witnesses. She simply stopped being the invisible hand that had been holding his business up for 3 years, and she let Richard Calloway find out, the same way she had learned everything about her own worth in that marriage, slowly, and without anyone telling him directly. The next few weeks unfolded the way Maggie expected they might, though she took no pleasure in watching it happen. Richard's bank called about the loan review. His attorney couldn't get answers from the fund beyond the standard letter. He grew short-tempered, distracted, and for the first time in years, he actually looked at Maggie, really looked at her, trying to read whether she knew something he didn't. She let him wonder. Bishop Development, meanwhile, had done their own due diligence and discovered the capital gap Richard had been racing to cover, and Marcus Bishop, a careful businessman, quietly began exploring other engineering partners for the project. Richard didn't lose the Bishop deal in one dramatic phone call. He lost it in a slow unraveling of missed follow-ups and hedged emails, the kind of failure that doesn't make a good story to tell at dinner parties, which was, Maggie thought privately, exactly the kind of ending her father would have approved of. It was Olivia who finally connected the pieces, 3 weeks later, home for a weekend and helping her mother sort through old paperwork in Walter Ashford's former study, now Maggie's office. She found a folder with the fund's letterhead and her mother's initials on approval lines going back years, and she looked up at Maggie with an expression that wasn't quite shock, more like something settling into place. "This is Dad's company's loan," Olivia said quietly. "You've been the one keeping him afloat this whole time." Maggie didn't deny it. She told Olivia everything. The trust, her father's condition of anonymity, the 3 years of silent support, and the decision she'd made in Denny Ford's office after the dinner at the Harpeth. Olivia didn't ask why her mother hadn't confronted him publicly, hadn't demanded an apology in front of Marcus Bishop and made him choke on his own cruelty. She understood, the way daughters sometimes understand their mothers only once they see the whole architecture of a life laid bare. "You didn't do it for revenge," Olivia said. "You did it because you finally stopped covering for him." Maggie just nodded, because that was closer to the truth than anything she could have said out loud. Richard found out 3 days after that conversation, not from Maggie, but from Denny Ford, who was legally obligated to disclose the fund's ownership once the loan officially lapsed, and Richard's firm formally requested a full accounting to search for new financing. Denny called Richard into his office and told him, as gently as a man can deliver that kind of news, that the fund which had quietly kept Calloway Structural alive for 3 years, the fund that had just let his expansion loan lapse without renewal, was managed entirely by his wife. Richard sat in that office for a long time without saying anything. Then he drove home, and he found Maggie in the kitchen, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, he didn't know what tone to use with her. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, and it wasn't an accusation. It was something smaller and more frightened than that. Maggie set down the dish towel and looked at him the way she'd wanted to look at him for years, without flinching and without apology. "Because you never asked what I did all day, Richard. You decided a long time ago that I didn't need to understand the business, remember? So I let you believe that. I let everyone believe that. And it turns out I understood it well enough to keep your company alive for 3 years while you told rooms full of strangers I don't do the business side of things." She wasn't shouting. She never raised her voice once. That, more than anything, seemed to unmake him. Richard didn't get his company back on solid footing overnight, and Maggie didn't offer to fix it for him. Calloway Structural downsized, took on smaller contracts, rebuilt slower and humbler than before, and Richard, for the first time in 18 years, had to build something without a silent safety net underneath him. There was a Tuesday in late autumn when Maggie came home to find him sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of vendor invoices, his tie loosened, looking older than she remembered him looking, and instead of feeling triumph, she mostly felt tired, the way you feel after setting down something heavy you've carried too long. She made him coffee anyway. Old habits, she told herself, don't disappear just because you've finally stopped performing them out of fear. He apologized to Maggie more than once in the months that followed, and some of it even sounded honest. The first apology, 3 days after Denny Ford's disclosure, was mostly panic dressed up as remorse, and Maggie recognized it for what it was. The second, a month later, came after he'd sat through an entire dinner at her father's old fund's holiday gathering, listening to 2 junior analysts talk about a due diligence model Maggie had built from scratch, watching people defer to his wife's judgment the way he'd once assumed the world deferred to his. He didn't say much on the drive home that night. He just reached over at a red light and took her hand, and Maggie let him, though she didn't reach back the way she once would have without thinking. He started asking her real questions about the fund after that, and actually listening to the answers instead of waiting for his turn to talk, the way a man does when he's finally run out of better options than paying attention. Maggie didn't rush toward forgiveness, and she didn't perform anger either. She simply started making decisions that were hers alone, taking a more active role at the fund under her own name for the first time since her father died, sitting on calls that Richard once assumed were beneath her, and discovering, somewhere in the middle of all that reclaiming, that she liked who she was when she wasn't shrinking to fit someone else's idea of a disappointing wife. Olivia told her once, over coffee again, that she'd never seen her mother laugh the way she laughed now, easy and unguarded, and Maggie hadn't realized until her daughter said it out loud just how long she'd been rationing that particular version of herself. The last anyone in Franklin heard, Maggie Calloway had renamed the fund after her father, Ashford Capital, and put her own name on the door of a small office downtown, 3 blocks from the courthouse, where she now meets clients in person instead of hiding behind initials. Richard still comes home to the same house every night. Whether that stays true forever, even Maggie isn't sure yet, and she stopped pretending she needs to have that answer today. What she does know is that she is done being quiet about who she is and what she built. Some mornings Richard watches her leave for the office in a sharp blazer instead of a cardigan, her hair pulled back the way her father used to wear his hat, and he doesn't say a word because he's finally learned that some silences are the ones you have to earn back. Maggie doesn't know if every marriage could survive what theirs did. She only knows that hers did, not because she forgave quickly, but because she finally let herself be seen, fully, for the first time in 31 years. And it turned out that was the thing Richard had been hungry for all along, whether he'd known how to ask for it or not. If this story spoke to your heart, share it with someone you love, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us what truly matters. Thank you for watching.